crawl outside in the ground, and they spin and become pupa in the grounds. And if it's really hard, it's harder for them to do that. And when they get in the ground, they bake, they dry out. So that's why people put them in full sun. Again, my philosophy is, if these colonies are really strong, they can keep the adults from laying eggs on the comb. The trick is, if you slip on anything, the beetle can take over very quickly. The eggs can hatch in less than 24 hours, and you can have a mess very quickly. So you've got to be on top of beekeeping at all times. This is a real problem in suburban areas. If you don't provide water, these bees will find your neighbor's swimming pool, air conditioning, bird baths, ornamental gardens, whatever. And once they get hooked on it, it's hard to get them off. So, and you got to be careful with your attitude. I really think as a beekeeper, you got to be kind of a responsible citizen. So I had a woman call me from Jackson this year, about a month ago. Said, I have a neighbor next to me, he has 3 colonies in the yard, his bees are coming to my swimming pool, they get caught in the water and they're stinging my kids. I've tried talking to him and his response was, prove they're my bees, leave me alone. Not a good attitude. They probably are his bees, you can't prove it, he can win in court. He's not being a good neighbor though. He really needs to provide his bees water that's closer so he's not being a nuisance to somebody. Because right now, as far as I know, there's no municipality in Mississippi that bans bees from city limits. But all it takes is incidents like that, and suddenly someone's got a bill before the board, and pretty soon bees are out of the city limits. So be a good neighbor. Think about just not yourself, but other beekeepers, because you're going to influence everyone when people get figuring bees are a nuisance. And this is the hardest thing, and this is what you should, if you don't have bees now, but you're thinking about getting them, go ahead and drive around and look at all the floral sources around you. And try and remember, bees fly on average 2.5 miles from their hive. So let's say you're going to put them in your backyard. Drive 2.5 miles in all directions, looking for fall wildflowers. Is there a lot of goldenrod? Is there a lot of smartweed, asters, ironweed? Those kind of plants to support my bees now, and then do the same thing in the spring. Look for the plants like clover. Down here you've got other things. You've got early on you always have maple and willow. Those are early. Then you have your clovers. Down here, saw palmetto, things like that, are a little later in the year. Tai. You have different things down here, and gallberry that we don't have a lot of up there. So it depends on where you live. But the point is, try and see, do you have plenty of floral sources around you? And just driving in a car, you may not know. You may just have to try and see what the bees do. I can say this, in most places in Mississippi, especially this part of Mississippi, you're not going to have a problem. There's usually enough food around. That's why so many northern beekeepers bring thousands of colonies to this part of the state for the early spring. They go through the winter here, and they get ready for their big spring buildup. They split their colonies so they can go get honey, and they do it in this area because it's so easy to grow bees in March, April here. So they're probably in this area, you're not going to have a big problem. Yeah, here's some of the other sourwood. I forgot about Chinese tallow. We don't have a lot of, do you have it here? I know they have a lot in Jackson area. Yeah. We don't have a lot in Starkville. The 2 row crops, soybean and cotton. There are beekeepers that love to put their bees on that, but you're risking your bees. The reason they love to do it, and the people who do this are professionals, like Steve Coy. You know Steve. Steve probably has, 2,000 or 3,000 colonies in the Delta. Most of them are probably on soybeans, some are on cotton. And he's probably getting more than 95 pounds of honey per colony. But he's taking a risk. Those colonies I showed you earlier that were dead, those were Steve's. Okay, but that was the first kill he had had in 5 years. So, but it's a risk, and he can take the risk.
His main headquarters is just down the road.
Yeah, I know, I've been there. I was there this spring with him, going through his bees.
While you're talking about that risk, what about the new seed that are being put out?
The neonics?
Yeah.
It's real controversial, but I'll tell you that, so just to give you an idea of what's going on, neonicotinoids is a class of insecticides that are very toxic to bees, okay? They're applying the insecticides to the seed coat for things like, they're not doing it for soybean, we want to think everything else. cotton, well, I'm drawing a blank, peanuts, I think even, canola. I don't think soybeans, they're the only ones that don't. And corn is the big one.
Corn is the big one.
And so there's been this argument, well, there's been two ways that these insecticides have affected bees. One's just like the traditional way. And what they discovered was in the Midwest, I think it was Indiana near Purdue, that at the time of corn planting, dust was being generated by the planter, because the planter is a pneumatic hopper that's blowing a seed down into the soil, and as it blew the seed that's coated with insecticide, it would create a dust that got in the air, drifted on bees, and killed a lot of colonies. To me, that's no different than any insecticide drift, and they've already basically solved that problem by building mufflers and stuff to the planters. The big debate, though, is can these chemicals, they persist. They're not like traditional insecticides that break down rapidly in the sun. They get systemic. The reason they coat the seed is when the seedling comes out, the insecticide goes into plant tissue and protects it till it's 10, 15 inches high. The question is it being expressed in the nectar and pollen 4 months later? And it turns out it is, but in tiny, tiny amounts. There's absolutely no scientific evidence that that is the reason bees have been dying. Although beekeepers have been suing, they're not going to win. The scientific evidence isn't there. What's complicating is the European Union banned them for their own reasons, which again is flimsy scientific data. So it's been a hot issue, but I can tell you this, right now, I'm not saying there can't be a problem. Right now, there's no hard evidence to say that that class of chemicals by itself is the reason that bees die in large numbers. They probably are contributing to the problem, just like any other insecticides are. But, so that's where I'll leave it. It's very controversial, but right now there's no substantive data to really back up the claim that neonicotinoids is what is killing the bees.
So it's kind of like the beekeeper saying, those aren't my bees.
Exactly. Well, no, I don't think so. The data's there because people are really looking hard. I mean, scientists are really trying to find the smoking gun, and they're really looking at that class of chemicals.
I think it's just a long-term buildup of stuff in the comb.
Well, the thing is, the neonics have been around about 10 to 15 years. The buildup in the comb, the highest ones I've seen are hundreds of parts per million, which is pretty high, but the average is more like 10 parts per million. And so the question is, are there sublethal effects? Well, no one knows because no one studies them until the last 3 years. So the answer may be they're certainly contributing, but there certainly is no correlation. When people lose 90% of their bees, the perfect example is a guy who lost 50,000 colonies last year. He's in an area where there are no neonicotinoids used. So that's not the reason he lost his bees. His exposure was minimal. He lost his bees because of not managing varroa well. That's part of the reason. And also drought. He was in a drought area. So there's a lot of reasons bees die. So I don't think it's exactly that same way because people are really looking. People really want to pin it on something. And they're looking hard at this class because they are so persistent. I'll give you an example. They used to say that this class of chemicals will not persist in the soil. Well, they're finding it persists well into the next year. And it ends up in dandelions growing next to it. So they just didn't know. So that's why I'm saying that there's no hard data now, but there may be in the future. Because so many people are looking at it. We're looking at it in Mississippi State. So, but right now, it's not the major cause of bee losses. I can tell you this, what is killing bees the most is varroa mite and the viruses. And then the chemicals beekeepers use to control their mites. That's the real problem in beekeeping. Plus drought some years.
Jeff, there's a video on, in fact, I watched it again last night. The title is The Silence of the Bees.
Right.
And it is worth your time to watch it. It will educate you about what you're talking about.
But I've seen some really emotional documentaries out there that have some wrong information in them. Like, I could spend all day on it. There's a really awesome documentary from scientists in Australia that I think is really fair and balanced. I just wish I could remember the name of it. Dennis Anderson is the main scientist. You can get it online. Look for a YouTube video with Dr. Dennis Anderson in it. It's pretty balanced about the whole problem. And so it's interesting. But there's some pretty melodramatic videos out there too that aren't quite, they're a little off on some things.
This one's very balanced.
Okay. I haven't seen that one. So keep in mind, how well your bees do just depends where you live. You know, what kind of floral sources do you have? And it's gonna take experience. You're not gonna know this when you come out the gate. It's gonna take a couple of years for you to figure out, oh, I can make 90 pounds of honey here per year in the springtime with my colony. Or no, I need to move my bees. I had a guy call me, Jeff, he's a good friend of mine. I've been trying to keep bees for 10 years up here, and I haven't had a single year where I got a yield of honey. I said, well, where do you live? He said, well, come out and see. I went out there. He lives in the middle of pine woods. Nothing to forage on. I mean, I drove for 10 miles in all directions. There's no food. I said, well, and he lives right on the edge just before the delta. I said, I hate to give you this advice, but I'm going to move those bees to soybeans. And he did. He called me a month afterward. He says, I already have 50 pounds of honey, and now I've talked to him recently. He's up to 90 pounds of honey per colony, and all he had to do was move them. So he's been struggling in a very barren landscape, no food. If you live in pine woods with no power line cuts or no roadsides, you're not going to do well. You need to find a place that has flowers blooming. Okay, when do you start? March is best. You can't get bees by March. What's the earliest you can get packages of bees or nukes or queens here?
End of March or April.
April 1. But you need to get on the list. In the packet, there's some suppliers for Mississippi, 23 or so, if you want to buy from them. You need to call in January 1. Put my name on the list. I want 2 nukes or I want 2 packages of bees and queens. If you don't get on the list, you're not going to get bees till late May, and that's a terrible time to start bees. My last 25 nukes, because of the bad weather, I got in May 31st, which I hate because bees cannot build up after the second week of May. I'm going to have to feed them. I've been feeding them to get them to draw comb because I started on the foundation, and I'm going to have to feed them to get them through the winter or into the winter. So the earlier the better. Most people, if you can start in April, you're doing well. And again, you want to think about the plants where you live. The N is for nectar, the P is for pollen. This kind of just gives you an idea of what's blooming in March in the different parts of the state. In Starkville this last spring, henbit was everywhere. It was great. Just carpets of purple in the pastures. We also had a lot of spring beauty, and they're kind of an off-white, and we had tons of clover this early spring. The problem was we got rain and cold, and the bees couldn't work it like we needed them to when they were blooming in March. It got cold and rainy into April, and the bees could not take advantage. Even though the flowers are blooming, it was too cold to forage and too rainy. So that happens sometimes too. Again, just kind of the asterisk ones are the ones that are major producers in these areas. And of course, you're paying more attention to South Mississippi. So get to know these plants. What they look like. Where's a big stand of tulip poplar? Where's a big stand of yopon or rattan vine or gallberry? Gallberry is a real big plant now. Do you guys sell your gallberry? It's not one of my favorite honeys, but it's a good source though. So then one question I always get is, what kind of bees do I buy? Well, I'm going to tell you, just start with Italian, just simply because it's a tradition in the South to use Italian, and even though they have certain characteristics that some people don't like, as a beginner, it's predictable what they're going to do, okay? Some of the things that people don't like about them is they tend to want to keep growing at times when there's not a lot of food coming in, so sometimes they can overeat their resources. Usually it's in July and August. However, they're really good at spring buildup. And the reason they're popular in the South is states like Mississippi and Alabama once led this country in selling bees to the rest of the world. North America, we had some of the biggest packers. In fact, in the 1930s, Mississippi led the U.S. in packaged honeybee production. And it's because of the climate, and that's why they like Italian bees. These bees will jump out of the gate in March and explode. They'll go from 20,000 bees to 50 or 60,000 bees in a month and a half. Really quick. And some of these other strains are slower at growing. Cardiolas, you don't see a lot of that. You see a lot more Caucasian. In fact, the Russian honeybees are kind of in that group. They will tend, what's good about them is they tend to moderate. As honey resources drop in the summertime, they will moderate and stop trying to grow. And so they're very good at saving resources in the summertime. They're a great overwintering bee. Why in the heck have anybody run across in cutouts or whatever German black bees in this area? I've seen them in this part of the state.
I like black bees.
You like them?
I went to Rob's when I was younger, and them were the meanest.
I was gonna say, I think I'd rather work Africanized bees than these things. They can be really bad. I was in France a year or so ago, and the French black bee is the same bee, but the French is better than German. And this guy was raving about his French black bees. And I went to work them, and they were horrible in terms of defense behavior. He loved them. I said, why do you like these bees? He goes, I don't know, they're just a great bee.